what we're doing here in the community and talk with a lot of people who are actively involved in this crisis we've kind of found ourselves in. And tonight we're talking with Paul Webster, who I met several years ago when he was working with Solutions for Change. And I know he's progressed through a few different things through HUD, and now he is. Paul, did you start Hope Street?
That's right.
Okay, so you're the creator. All right, wonderful. Well, Paul, we really enjoy your time tonight. We're glad you're joining us. I know you have a wealth of information to share with us and a lot of questions for us. So why don't you go ahead and jump off here?
All right. Well, I'll do a real quick intro. So my background is in legislation and policy. I spent 12 years working in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. I came back to my native San Diego, did some work with Mark Weiland when he was assemblyman and senator. And then over the time, I spent about 4 or 5 years working locally at Solutions for Change and learned a lot about homelessness, and particularly about the legislation and the policies coming out of not only Washington, D.C., but also Sacramento, that governs what happens in communities with respect to homelessness. A little over a year ago, at the end of 2019, I got hired by the Department of Housing and Urban Development to focus specifically on the continuum of care and the federal programs on homelessness, and really was able to dive in deep into a lot of the data, national data, and even some local data on homelessness. And so I've come up with some interesting, to me, it's interesting analysis about what's driving unsheltered homelessness. And I wanted to share that with you and take some questions. I know that I've really enjoyed being a part of Take Back Oceanside and listening to what's going on in the community. So I was going to go through a quick PowerPoint presentation that I created to show you some data, and maybe that data will help drive some discussion in terms of what we could do actually in Oceanside with respect to the homelessness crisis. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh. Yeah, I think that's good. Okay. So my presentation is homelessness, mental illness, and chronic addiction and their impact on communities. Are you seeing the screen okay, Drew?
Yeah, we got you, Paul.
Okay, good. So this is a site we see a lot of, and this is a question that I like to ask folks, and that is, homelessness really about housing, or is there something else going on? When we listen to the folks from HUD, when we listen to the folks from a lot of the homeless advocacy programs, all they say is that, what we need is more affordable housing. And when I was at HUD, HUD is the agency that provides the majority of the funding from the government for affordable housing. And we made some conclusions about the homelessness assistance programs and if they actually work with respect to affordable housing. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is just funding. So since the beginning of the Continuum of Care program, is the major driver from the federal government on how communities can address homelessness, we've seen a steady increase in funding. So we've had more funding from the federal government than ever before. Combine that with the funding that comes from the state of California and the funding that comes from the cities, both the city of the San Diego County and also the city of Oceanside. There has never, ever been before more funding to address homelessness than there is now. In fact, in this chart, it shows that for 2020, we're essentially approaching about $6 billion in funding for homelessness assistance programs just from the federal government for all across the country. At the same time that funding has increased, capacity has increased. And what I mean by capacity is the number of units, the number of beds, the number of vouchers or rapid rehousing assistance has never been greater. And you see this chart here, starting from 2007, where we were tracking emergency shelter beds, transitional housing beds, and permanent supportive housing beds. And throughout until 2019, this red little wedge in here reflects the increase in rapid rehousing beds. And the rapid rehousing beds actually started to cannibalize some of the transitional housing beds because HUD made that policy decision. But the black line here at the top shows a drop and then a steady increase lately in unsheltered homelessness. So the conclusion is that as funding has increased and has capacity has increased to house people, unsheltered homelessness has increased as well. And that's data from all across the United States. And it's even more so here in Southern California.
Can we go back to that last slide? I have a quick question.
Absolutely.
So we're looking at that. Yeah, we're looking at that black line, and there's some text that says change in focus from services to vouchers. Now, is that referring to the vouchers for like if a homeless person was to get services through the city with like a hotel or motel voucher program?
Kind of. The vouchers that are referred to here is kind of a broad category of permanent supportive housing subsidies, rapid rehousing vouchers, if you will, referrals to rapid rehousing. See, what happened in 2013 is in the notice of funding availability through HUD to communities, to specifically here in San Diego County, the San Diego Regional Task Force on the Homelessness, there was a policy decision that was changed. And instead of focusing on housing combined with rich wraparound services, what they started to do was emphasize more just on the housing. The services were still a part of it, but they were much less of a priority. And because the thinking at the time was, and the thinking that still exists, is that housing solves homelessness. So if we could just really redouble our efforts to build more permanent supportive housing, and here in terms of rapid rehousing, because permanent supportive housing was taking so long to bring online, then we'll see a dent in homelessness. And what's interesting is you can see this black line that shows unsheltered homelessness starting in 2007 actually had a pretty significant dip, and it was dipping through, and then the lag from the policy change, you can see a steady increase in unsheltered homelessness. So we saw about a year lag in the policy change before we started seeing increases in unsheltered homelessness. So
Paul, is there any data? I'm just curious. So once someone gets into one of these programs, like a transitional housing or a rapid rehousing, what's the data on them actually being able to get kind of out of this cycle of chronic homelessness? Is there any information on that?
Yeah, there's kind of a theoretical policy answer, and then there's a practical answer. The theoretical policy answer is that transitional housing and rapid rehousing are both limited for 24 months. So you cannot be housed in transitional housing for more than 2 years, and you can't receive rapid rehousing subsidies for more than 2 years. I want to say it was about 2017, 2016, HUD engaged in a very significant study called the Family Options Study. Now, the Family Options Study was important because it was testing this theory that folks that aren't quote unquote chronically homeless, can they actually move out from rapid rehousing subsidy? And it showed about 50% success rate. Unfortunately, about 50% of those also returned to homelessness. And the biggest reason cited was there was no incentive for them to continue paying rent after the 24 months. So it's kind of like, I'll take your 24 months of subsidy, but then I don't know what I'm going to do. And so a lot of these populations fell back into homelessness.
Well, and that's kind of what I was leading to, because I've talked to a lot of people who've been through these programs who have got some of the help and some of the services that go along with it, and the outcome that seems very very prevalent is that they still wind up going right back to the street after they've extended all their time in these programs. So
Yeah.
I know we're spending, I mean, obscene amounts of money on these programs, and on the surface, like you said, it seems like, well, this is a homeless person. All we have to do is get them a house, and then they're no longer homeless. So
Well,
it sounds simple enough on the surface, but we've kind of found it's anything but.
yeah, and I'll go into that in the next couple of slides, at least based on my analysis. So you need to understand that the way that HUD collects its data on who's homeless is they collect data on what they call sheltered and unsheltered homelessness. So sheltered homeless are folks that are in shelters. We actually, it's technically folks who are in transitional housing and in shelters are both still considered homeless, even though they're sheltered. Folks who are living out on the street are considered unsheltered. And one of the bones that we really have to pick on the policy side is people in rapid rehousing, even though it's a 24-month program, are considered no longer homeless. And also people in permanent supportive housing are considered no longer homeless. So for accounting purposes, they basically check a box. Where did you come from? Oh, you're homeless, or you're not homeless still. So there's a little bit of data challenges there. So I'm going to move forward here to what we really see when we, and this is just confirmed in the annual homelessness assessment report to Congress was just released the other day. And what we see is that according to the point in time count, about 353,000 people are staying in shelters or transitional housing. About 226,000 are in unsheltered locations or living in encampments or on the street. But the static number only tells half the picture. When you look at the increase of where things are going, you can see that statically, we're seeing about a 2% increase in all homelessness across the country. But that 2% increase is being driven by a much more significant increase in unsheltered homelessness. So according to the AHAR, it's about a 7% increase for people unsheltered. But here in the West Coast, that unsheltered increase is much higher than 7%. It varies anywhere from 12% to 25% in places like Los Angeles and Seattle. So the conclusion is homelessness is being driven nationally and increasing nationally because of the increase in people living on the streets, not people living in shelters. So my next question is, well, who are the people who are living on the streets? HUD doesn't do a very good job of that with that data, but UCLA just a couple of years ago, 2019, at the end of 2019, they did the largest survey of people living on the streets. And what they found was 78% of folks living on the street have a mental health condition, and 75% have substance abuse conditions. And as you know, most of these folks a lot of them have comorbidity. They're both mentally ill and substance abuse. And the interesting thing about this, so I live in Vista. Vista hired a social worker, I want to say maybe about a year or so ago, and we just did a census in Vista of our unsheltered homeless population. Now, obviously, Vista is smaller than Oceanside. Oceanside is the largest city in North County. Vista had 73 unsheltered homeless. Out of those 73 unsheltered homeless, 78% have a mental illness, and a little less than 75% have substance abuse disorders. So the national data is tracking, at least in Vista. So the conclusion is mental illness and addiction are driving the suffering that we see on the streets. And there's a real, and this is really important, because when you understand that we've increased funding and that we've increased capacity, but we're still seeing unsheltered homeless, and the people who are experiencing that unsheltered homeless are folks who are experiencing mental illness and addiction, to me, it begs the question that we have a gap in those who are the most vulnerable, and that gap has to do not just with housing, but with barriers to treatment for mental illness and chronic addiction. And that's really what I wanted to spend some time on. So,
and Paul, I think those numbers put forward by the UCLA, and I know the LA Times did a similar count. I think they surveyed 4,000 homeless people in LA and found similar results. I know the point in time count conducted in Los Angeles had some varying results that didn't coincide with what I think people like me and you and even Paul Brent commented that homelessness go hand in hand with drug use and mental illness. And I think that's what a lot of us are seeing on the street. I think it's hard to not realize that that's affecting a large portion of that community. So that kind of leads to a bigger issue, is how do we actually address that? And I know you're looking at how we can kind of make some gains here as far as the mental illness side of the homelessness.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Let me give you an illustration of how out of phase the narrative is to the reality. So according to the homeless advocates, the reason that there are so many folks who are homeless is because of economic inequality, in that people just can't afford the rent. If we made housing more affordable, then more people would be able to afford the rent and homelessness would resolve. That's the narrative coming out of the advocates.
Right.
I know that in Oceanside, one of the challenges of homelessness and the costs on the community has to do with people in the riverbed wandering into the 76. What's interesting, so Paul Brent says that's not true. Okay, fine. So what's interesting is I spent some time in Austin, and Austin, 85% of the pedestrian and vehicle accidents are among the homeless. The homeless are causing 85% of the pedestrian and vehicle accidents. And so
I know just recently we've seen a few people run over the street on Oceanside Boulevard, homeless individuals.
Yeah.
Which now we have a growing encampment right on South Oceanside Boulevard due to I guess in part to the fact that we don't really have a shelter here in Oceanside, and we can't really do much to address the tents that are popping up all over there.
Right. So the challenge is, this challenge that's happening in Oceanside is the same challenge that's happening in Salt Lake City, in Denver, in Chico, across, mostly across the West Coast. And this was really interesting. I was following a next door conversation here in Vista, and they were talking about, the complaints from the community about how there were so many folks who were unhoused, that had tents or RVs or just, sleeping in doorways over by the old Burlington Coat Factory off of Sycamore.
All right.
And what was interesting about that is that the councilman jumped into the next door conversation, and he said, every single person that is unsheltered in Vista has been offered shelter and services. And the reason that we're seeing people in Vista unhoused is because they're not accepting the help that's being offered. And this is true in what's happening in Los Angeles, what's happening in so many other places, is that now a lot, you could argue the fact that well, some places don't have enough beds, or some people, don't have enough access or whatever. But the fact is that there is such a significant rate of refusal of housing and services. And the question is, why is that? Well, I want to, if you look at the UCLA data and the high percentage of folks that are mentally ill or seriously addicted, we run into a real interesting issue with respect to the federal government's reimbursements to states with having to do with psychiatric care. One of the challenges that's happening in communities is people who are mentally ill or are experiencing some kind of psychosis because of a drug addiction. They'll get called, on a 5150 hold. The police will come. They'll send them to an emergency room. They'll take them to an emergency room. Sometimes they'll end up in jail, but oftentimes because of the lack of psychiatric beds, the folks will just kick them back to the streets. So you have this endless cycle of street, emergency department, jail, and street. And what's happening is people are just decompensating right in front of us. And it's fascinating when you are seeing the costs associated with emergency service responders and emergency room visits. The public is bearing those costs. And the reason that people aren't able to stay longer for psychiatric holds or even for holds that have to do with drug treatment is because there's just not enough psychiatric care, because the federal government has a policy that caps the reimbursement to states for Medicaid for psychiatric care. So we've got this circular loop. The other challenge is that in the state of California, we have a law that governs conservatorship for those who are mentally ill called the Lanterman-Petrus Act. And the threshold is so high that it's really, really difficult. I mean, Dr. Drew has a great video that's on my website that says you can have somebody in active psychosis who is clearly decompensating physically, who has an addiction to meth, is clear, and yet if they tell you that they know where they get food and they know where they're going to sleep, there's nothing can be done about them. And this is the challenge. We've got at the federal level a disincentive for states to provide the psychiatric care that's necessary to treat these people who are suffering on the streets. But at the same time, in the state of California, we can't get people the treatment they need because they don't even understand how ill they are, so they can't consent to treatment. So it's a very vicious cycle.
Oh, thank you so much for bringing up the conservatorship argument, because that's something that I've discussed with a lot of people in the industry, and it pains me to see a lot of these people. You're right; they're killing themselves in the most inhumane way possible on these streets. And what we're seeing by a lot of the homeless advocates, surprisingly, is them fighting for their right to exist on the street. And what we see with a lot of these organizations here, across the country, but even right here in Oceanside, is so much enabling to not really get them the services they need, but to actually just make them more comfortable on the street, which it's heartbreaking to watch. I mean, absolutely heartbreaking. I see people who are obviously, in some real deep depths of either substance abuse or mental illness, and just not getting the help. And what we're doing here in Oceanside is we're not getting them where they need to be. And we have this homeless outreach team. We're spending millions of dollars a year on it. And like you said, there's a lot of people who just won't accept services. Now, whether or not that's because they're enjoying the lifestyle they're currently in, or they're just so lost in their illness or addiction that they aren't mentally capable of getting the help that they really need. Because I think that once people are in some care, and again, I've went to a number of NA and AA meetings to talk with some of these recovering addicts and alcoholics. And one of the main topics, the kind of the recurring theme I heard there was that I would be dead if it wasn't for me going to jail. And,
Yeah.
I hate hearing that, but I also love hearing that because through that, they were able to get, away from some of the people who are supplying whatever their addiction is. They're able to get into the jail or prison system, and they're actually able to see a doctor. And once away from, their substance abuse, and they're able to get some of the psych medication that they need, they seem to do so much better and really begin to flourish. And then they can kind of see that vision of, wow, what was I doing with my life, and how do I actually rehabilitate myself? And I think that's kind of what the huge problem is that we're experiencing here in California, is that with the passage of Prop 47 and Prop 57, we're not arresting people anymore. And, I hate that we can't get people to the help that they need without putting them in jail, but it doesn't really seem to be a lot of options. And this conservatorship, you go look at the ACLU, who fights so hard to make sure that we aren't able to do that. And like you said, the threshold is so high to get these people any sort of real help that we can't really do anything with these people. So they continue this slow life of killing them on the street.
Yeah, I've had parents of mentally ill people who have said, my son is going to die on the streets with all of his rights intact. And unfortunately, because the ACLU and the disability rights groups scare city councils and state legislators into acting against the best interest of people suffering on the streets through lawsuits, we have the circumstance that we have because it's very lucrative to bring civil rights lawsuits, even though you have, so I just saw a question, this is a good question. What's the conservatorship threshold? So part of the conservative threshold is you have to be a danger to yourself or a danger to others. And the problem is that's so high, that's such a high threshold because, it's kind of like, well, what do I, I've had parents and family members of mentally ill people saying, who do I have to hurt so that I can get my son conserved? Who do they have to hurt to get my son conserved? And so there's a real challenge in between the balance of civil rights and the best interest of the patient. The challenge is that when people do get treatment, when they can get stabilized, when they get on a regimen of psychotropic drugs to help them, they're actually pissed off that they had to suffer so much before somebody actually, the process actually allowed them to begin to heal. And I think that's one of the real challenges. And so one of the big arguments is, well, just give people housing and once they're in housing, then they'll be stabilized and they can make some of these decisions, to get off drugs. But people don't understand that what you're asking people who are not in their rational minds to do is to be rational. And you can't do that when you're untreated with a mental condition or you're in serious addiction and in a psychosis. And there is actually a psychological term called anosognosia, which basically means that people are so ill, they can't recognize their own depravity and their own need for treatment. The other thing that's interesting is among the caregivers, the public psychiatric caregivers, is there's this concept that since there's such a scarcity of treatment beds, that maybe we need to do an evaluation to see if people are negotiating homelessness successfully. And the concept is, look, if you and I might not want to live in an encampment, but if this person believes that that's the best place for them to be, then maybe we should allow them to do that because we can't get them into treatment anyway. And I just think that is such a poor way to treat people, is to say, we're just going to enable you in your self-destructive choices. And I think that that's just a tragedy of our society right now.
What is the chances to open a psychiatry or they call it now mental behavioral, right? I know back then Reagan closed all that institution, right?
That's right.
The problem is not the lack of affordable housing. It's mental issue, addiction is mental issue, or even back then when 2 years ago, we had a problem on the hydrocodone for paid bills. That's another addiction, right? So why can't the government open just one facility, just a test, to say that you can go to this place and someone can help you, some therapy, or and like my girlfriend said, since everybody's enabling them, so put them in a warehouse, give them all the drugs, let them all die. And I said, that's inhuman.
Yeah. And really the answer to your question, there's two answers to the question. The first answer to the question is that states are disincentivized to create more psychiatric care units because the federal government puts a cap. It's called the Institutes of Mental Diseases Exclusion. And what the IMD exclusion does is it says, the federal government says, we will pay if you have a nursing home or a psychiatric unit in the psychiatric unit in a hospital, or you even have some kind of residential treatment facility, we will pay for the first 16 beds. But if you're number 17, we won't pay anymore. So when you go back to the data and see that 75% of those experiencing unsheltered homelessness have some kind of mental illness and or drug addiction, we're trying to empty the encampments of the mentally ill and drug addicted with a 16-bed paper cup. It's just insufficient. And so what's happening is the streets are become the dumping grounds. And Michelle, I think it's great that you brought up the deinstitutionalization that destroyed a lot of the mental health clinics. Right now, according to the Treatment Advocacy Center, there's about 160,000 people with mental illness who are unsheltered in our community, but not in our community, across the country. But we only have 40,000 psychiatric beds. So we have, 4 times as many people who need psychiatric care and psychiatric beds than we have the beds to serve them. And this is just part of the problem. So, and one of the reasons I bring this up is because a lot of people go to the city councils and they say, why can't you do anything about the condition of my communities? Why can't you do anything to help these people that are suffering on the streets? Well, the city council, their hands are tied because it's not in their purview to build state psychiatric facilities. At the same time, the city council doesn't have any authority to contravene the Lanham-Petras Act and begin to conserve people, that's opposed to state law. So that's the reasons that I started this new coalition that I'm calling the Hope Street Coalition. It's to advocate in the right places so that we can actually start seeing some changes in the systemic barriers to getting people off of the streets, getting the folks who have mental health issues off the streets, and getting people who have drug addiction and need treatment off the streets. And so, if you want to go to my website, hopestreetcoalition.org, and sign up, get on my little newsletter list, I encourage you to do that.
So Paul, it's interesting because you brought up the people who don't want services, and I heard a new term not too long ago that kind of stuck with me, and it wasn't the homeless or the unsheltered, but now there's a whole group that they're referring to as the home free, as people who don't want to live in a home, they don't want to kind of exist and have responsibilities, and they don't mind sleeping in the tent and having that freedom. I mean, it's I think that if the if the issue wasn't hard enough to address as it was, I mean, now what do we do with this other group of people that you know, who are so stuck in their, you know, what looks like addiction or mental illness, and they don't want that help or treatment?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting problem, and it has to do with what is the demographics of, for example, the folks that are living on the street or a homeless encampment. So you could say, you know, and I demonstrated with the national data that shows that, you know, a large majority of the population have some kind of mental illness, some kind of substance abuse. Okay, so let's talk about the other 20%. I don't know what to do about the other 20%. I want to focus on the 80% who I actually can do something about by advocating at the state and the federal level by saying, stop the suffering on the streets, do your job, end the IMD exclusion, reform Lanterman and Petra Short. Oh, and by the way, HUD, instead of funding permanent supportive housing, let's start funding housing for folks where you can actually require treatment and you can actually require the kinds of things that are going to help people move out and improve their life. That's one of the things that really bothers me. The requirement for the state of California and at HUD is that you cannot provide somebody housing and actually require them to have skin in the game. So permanent supportive housing comes with no strings. You don't have to be sober. You don't have to be a part of a program. You don't have to work. You just have to come up with that 30% rent, which the homelessness assistance providers are more than happy to qualify you for Social Security disability payments so you can make that 30%. And the problem is that by offering those services to this population, you're actually skipping over the most vulnerable, because the folks who've got these chronic addictions and these mental health issues, they're not the ones that are able to pick up their Social Security disability checks. And they're not the ones who are going to stay housed. So there's a real challenge. There's some real gaps. I actually think that if we did right by the people who are suffering on the streets, you would see a reduction in some of the gang activities going on, because the people that they exploit and prey upon will now be getting the treatment that they need. And then the law enforcement can deal with these free spirits who think that it's their right to pitch a tent on property that you and I, if we wanted to purchase that property, we probably couldn't afford it. So there's a little bit of a double standard going on there in terms of, you know, the right to people to pitch a tent, but, you know, yet you and I can't do that if we wanted to claim our property rights there. So I'm less concerned about these free spirits than I am really about the folks who are suffering on the streets. And they're suffering on the streets not because of behavioral issues. They're suffering on the streets because they have an illness. They have a mental illness, they have a brain disease, or they're so chronically addicted, they have a substance use disorder that can actually be successfully treated with either sobriety programs, or even with the most severe, they can be treated with medically assisted treatment.
So Paul, I'd love to have a call to action here. What is something that we can do to try to bring this? You know, I don't even know if it would help at a state level, but maybe at a federal level where we can start. I mean, because obviously the federal government has, well, we just saw the $1.9 trillion stimulus passed here. I mean, I'd love to see this, and it's something that never gets brought. It's never part of the conversation during any of these presidential elections. Is the fact that we do have, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who live in America, one of the richest, wealthiest countries in the world, living on the streets in an absolute squalor. I mean, how is that something that we can address?
Well, I think that there's actually, I've devised a little bit of an interesting strategy. And the strategy is this: instead of asking our city councils to do something that they just can't do, I think it's important to suggest, hey, city councils, we recognize the problem. The problem is with the state government and with the federal government. Would you pass a resolution that costs the city of Oceanside zero, but at least puts the weight of the city of Oceanside to our federal elected officials like Mike Levin, or even our state elected officials like Tasha Borna-Horvath and Pat Bates, and say, Mike Levin, you need to end the IMD exclusion. It is within your power. You need to understand how much suffering on the street occurs because the federal government caps the level of psychiatric care for the state of California. That is something that the city council can actually do, and we can advocate at the federal government because this is not something that is foreign to federal consideration. Last year, the Trump administration actually put into their budget, and we're actually considering ending the IMD exclusion. So it's something that is actually tangible right now if we get enough advocacy behind it. The same thing right now, there are conversations about reforming the Landerman-Petra Short Act with respect to conservatorships. What we need to do is we need to ask our city council people who say, hey, listen, city council person, we know that you've got no authority over conservatorships, but would you pass a non-binding resolution? It costs the city of Oceanside nothing, but it expresses the will of the people of Oceanside that says, we need help. We want the state of California to do a better job balancing civil rights and the desire for people to get help because they're deteriorating in the street. I would, if you go to hopestreetcoalition.org, sign up. I've got some resources. I could give you some more information on that and show you how to do that. So that would be my area of advocacy. I mean, I've been to city council meetings. I've seen how frustrated people are with their city councils. They want the police to do their job. Well, it's not the city councils that are preventing the police from doing their job. It's the Ninth Circuit Court and it's the state of California. So put the blame on the people who really, deserve it. And at the same time, there are issues with the federal government in terms of how they implement the continuum of care program and whether or not it actually is successful in reducing homelessness. I got to tell you, I did an analysis for Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is really easy to beat up on because they're so big and the problem is so bad. But here's the point. The city and county of Los Angeles over the last few years has received from the federal government, has received from the state of California, has taxed itself, has raised philanthropically more than $6 billion to address homelessness in Los Angeles. Yet homelessness in Los Angeles is increasing between 18 to 25% a year. I think last year it was something like 16%. So to me, that's pretty clear that you're raising all this money for a strategy that doesn't have any impact on what you're exactly trying to do, which is reduce the suffering on the streets. And so we need to go to the source, which is the federal government and the state of California, and tell people that we want our communities improved. We want help for the people suffering on the streets. And it's not our city councils that are standing in the way. It's our state governments and our federal governments.
Now, Paul, I got kind of a 2, maybe 3-part question here. So, when I talk to a lot of homeless advocates, I had a lot of discussions with Oceanside's previous housing director, and what I hear is that the people here on the streets actually are from either the city or from the state. And, when I've talked to people on the street, it doesn't seem like that actually coincides with the fact. I hear a lot of people who come here from lots of different parts of the country. And I'm just curious, as with your involvement with HUD, was there any data in tracking why we have such a prevalence of homeless population here on the West Coast, as opposed to some of these other states that aren't kind of seeing the numbers that we're experiencing?
So the answer to that question is there is no real HUD data. It's some very interesting ways for them to find out where people were homeless last, and that's, they ask people where you were homeless last, and that's where they determine where they're from. Well, I was last homeless in San Diego. Okay, well, you're from San Diego. But the real challenge isn't necessarily where people are from, because we're seeing homelessness increase. I mean, homelessness.
No, really bad again.
California is only second,
For
kind of neck and neck with New York. So New York has a significant homeless problem. California, Seattle, Denver, Austin, San Antonio is starting to have a more presence on the street. The issue, in my view, is the incentives to be homeless. California makes it very easy. People on the West Coast, Oregon, Washington State, make it very easy to be homeless. They provide significant incentives, significant benefits. I mean, just the fact that I can go to California and smoke methamphetamine and not worry about getting arrested is a significant incentive. So, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing in different localities, different attitudes towards, law enforcement, the right to be homeless, and other kinds of services. When you talk to, so I had a conversation with some of the folks down in Skid Row. I have a lot of conversations with those folks in Los Angeles. And they say, one of the things that people don't understand is that people on the streets don't go hungry. So stop giving them food. They don't go hungry. They throw the food in the gutter that they don't want, and they take the food that they do want. And so there's significant tie-in to sources of resources, whether it's clothes, whether it's showers, whether it's food, whatever it is, and a proliferation of homeless encampments, because a lot of encampments go where there's services close by. And so California is rich with services. We have very lax laws pertaining to public camping, pertaining to theft, pertaining to drug use and drug dealing. And so it creates a very comfortable environment for people who want to do that. Unfortunately, when they do engage in those kinds of behaviors, they find it very difficult to pay the rent, because they're using whatever money they have to do other things. And for the folks who are mentally ill or chronically addicted, it's not even a choice. So that's probably, that's some of the things that I've seen and I believe to be true. It's just a law of economics. If you make things easier, you're going to get more of it, and if you make things harder, you're going to get less of it.
It's interesting because you named Seattle and Denver and New York and San Francisco, and a lot of these places that have, really, really high market values on real estate. And it kind of goes into this whole, well, is it affordable housing issue? And I know this is one of the comments that were put on the group was, well, is Paul Webster the guy who's talking about affordable housing being a sham? And it's funny because I talked to some of these people, and just in the newspaper, they were interviewing the guy who set up these tents on South Oceanside Boulevard, and he says, I've been homeless, he's 52 years old. He says, I've been homeless for 37 years. Now, 37 years ago, did we still have the same affordable housing crisis that we have today? I mean, it's incredibly restrictive for a lot of people who live in California. I know this because a lot of people I grew up with, they started raising families and just couldn't make it. And you see this huge pilgrimage, which we were kind of discussing earlier, of people leaving California who were second, third, even fourth generation Californians, and moving to Idaho and Texas and a lot of these places that don't have such high cost of housing. And so I guess, I mean, what's your take? Is the simple fact that people can't afford housing? Because it doesn't seem like if the cost of housing was even an issue, I feel like we would still have these people living on the street.
I think the cost of housing is an issue, and I think affordable housing is an important aspect, but I don't think affordable housing is a solution for reducing homelessness. And people may disagree with that statement because they really believe in affordable housing. Okay, I'm not going to disabuse you of your belief in affordable housing, but just be honest and don't say that affordable housing reduces homelessness, because I've shown you the data and it's just not true. You're going to just need to explain what you said then. So here's the issue. When you look at the state of California and you look at the kinds of costs and the regulations and the excessive regulatory burdens that go into creating housing, there's no market incentive to create affordable market rate housing. If you talk to a housing developer and they say, well, I used to build homes in Southern California, they're electing to build homes that are in the $600,000 and $700,000 and $800,000 range. Well, why are they doing that? Because that's the only price point that can pencil out, the only price point where they can make a profit. So what happens is the state of California comes in and says, we'll cover your margin by giving you lots of tax incentives and lots of subsidies so that you could build multifamily affordable housing. Okay, fine. I don't have a problem with that. Here's the challenge, though, is if you're somebody who is low income in California, you are experiencing so many regressive taxes, gas taxes, rent control, prevailing wage, mandatory minimum wages. Listen, I'm very fortunate in that I don't have to really think about how much gas costs. So if I want to take a trip to Modesto or to Phoenix, I can get in my car and go. People who are on limited incomes, who are low incomes, the gas tax hurts them more than it hurts me. So it reduces their ability to go where they need to go. That's a regressive tax. Affordable housing is a regressive tax, because when I take housing out of the market that's market rate and I exclude people from taking advantage of that housing by saying that you can only be in this housing if you make a certain amount of money, then what that does is it raises the rents in the market rate housing around it. That is a regressive tax because it impacts the poor people who are now unable to afford where they want to afford. They have to go to rent control. They have to go to subsidized housing. So to me, the answer to creating more affordable housing is stop requiring project labor agreements, stop requiring prevailing wage, stop putting so many onerous regulations on the cost of housing so that the cost of housing actually begins to reflect the demand in the area. And I don't know, I mean, I've heard from a lot of economists and analysts saying that California might be at a point of no return where you're never ever going to get that kind of market rate housing because of the scarcity and because of the speculation on places to develop. But those places to develop, that's why the permanent supportive housing in Los Angeles is so expensive, because it's so speculative to build. The only places to build are extremely expensive. They're extremely expensive to build on because these are places where everybody is passed up saying, I don't want to build on that piece of land. It's hard, it's expensive. I'm going to have to do a lot of different things. And Los Angeles actually did a really bad job of managing the bond money for the Triple H housing. They lost something like $50 million in just soft costs and in bond mismanagement. But here's the other thing. When you look at what's called the capital stack, the money that goes into subsidized housing, it's so complicated between local subsidies, state subsidies, tax credit investment subsidies, Section 8 vouchers. It takes forever to put these deals together. And the longer it takes to put these deals together, the longer this housing is available to the public. And that's why communities told HUD, they said, permanent supportive housing, it's a great idea, but just give us a voucher so that we can put people in rapid rehousing or give them rental assistance, because that's much quicker and more effective to get people housed than waiting on permanent supportive housing and the development of permanent supportive housing. And that's why I say that this housing is not intended for the people who are living on the streets. If you basically give somebody who's suffering with a mental illness or a chronic addiction a voucher and say, go out there and find an apartment. There's landlords out there that we know of that will accept your voucher. That is an impossible task for somebody who's got a mental illness or is chronically addicted. And this is why we need to advocate specifically for the people suffering on the streets, because those people are the ones who are deteriorating in plain sight in spite of the ever-increasing amount of money and despite of the ever-increasing capacity to house people. So that's what I'm advocating for. If people want to keep advocating for permanent housing and affordable housing, okay, fine, go ahead. I'm not going to get upset about that. But for God's sakes, put just as much effort into creating housing that heals, housing that treats people, housing that actually helps people stabilize and get past their mental illness so that they can regain their families and they can stop living in squalor and destitution on the streets.
It's interesting too, because on top of the restrictiveness and the cost it is to develop it here in California, what we've seen is a proliferation of people who, first of all, don't want these affordable housing units built in their communities, but who actually band together and sue developers on really petty things like sequel lawsuits, where they say, well, this is going to affect the storm water mitigation or something to that effect. So on top of all this restrictiveness, now we have people who will hold up development for years if they can. And what I've kind of what I've learned is that people are doing this because there's a lot of money to be made. If I hold this developer up in court, well, of course they're going to want to settle with me. So now I can make a couple $100,000 just selling out of court to get this thing built. So, on top of everything else, now you're looking at people who actually profit off of, restricting or delaying these developments from being built.
And there's a lot of extortion going on like that. That's why
that's a great word for it.
It really is. I mean, have anybody who's in the commercial real estate business or owns commercial real estate has probably received a letter from an attorney saying, I'll bet you have a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I don't know if you do, but I'll bet you if I go there, I'll find one. So you can either do one of two things. I'll sue you and you can go through the legal settlement, legal issues, or you can hire me and I'll make sure that I won't sue you. It's extortion. Is really what it is. It's ridiculous.
You're absolutely right.
This is why I'm focusing on these people who are suffering, these people because they have a mental illness and because the psychiatric care is in such abysmal shape and because we have such thin treatment services. I'm focusing on these poor people who are deteriorating on our streets right in front of our eyes. Because when I have a battle with people who are talking about, no, we need more money for affordable housing. No, we need to keep people's civil rights intact. No, we can't possibly, go back to the state mental asylums that were featured in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm going to say, so you would prefer that these people continue to die and suffer on the streets, because that's the consequence of what's happening. If we're not going to invest in things that actually help people who that we can see with our eyes are suffering on our streets in our communities, then I don't know what to tell you. I mean, that's just the humanitarian crisis of our time. And I'm advocating for people to join me and call out the federal government, the state government. I'll call out the county of San Diego, because they're not doing a very good job with providing a lot of these psychiatric resources to people who are suffering. And we need to band together, and we need to do that. If we do it, we're going to save lives, we're going to improve the community, and we're going to save money, because it's cheaper to put people into treatment, into some kind of an appropriate housing for treatment, than it is for these poor people suffering with mental illness to be on the streets, to be put in jail, to be put in emergency departments, and go round and round and round again until they decompensate to the point where they die, or they end up in prison where they're locked away for good because they did something stupid that caused them to be sentenced. And I think that if we can agree on something, we should be able to agree that we can help these people that are suffering on the streets, and there's ways that we can do it.
Paul, earlier here in the meeting, Mary Lou asked a great question, and she asked, has the homeless issue become a commodity? And I think that's really what we've seen is there's so much money involved in this and trying to, I guess, solve this problem, when in reality, I think what we're seeing is people fighting for it because they don't want to lose clients. Every person off the street is less money, potentially coming in for their charity or their resource or, whatever they're involved in. And, it kind of makes some of us wonder, is this a business, or are you actually trying to solve an issue here?
Yeah. So I'll answer that two ways. So the first way is based on my knowledge of how HUD actually requires the people who receive homelessness assistance dollars. They require the continuums of care to provide system performance measures. The problem is the system performance measures are process measures. It's like, how many blankets and burritos have we handed out today? Oh, we must be doing great because we handed out so many blankets and burritos that we're all out of them. Well, the real system performance measure should be, we can't give away any more blankets and burritos because people don't need them anymore. And that is a systemic problem. That's one of the barriers that we have in terms of making our homeless assistance programs actually effective, is we don't have good system performance measures that actually track and report back to the community. This is how we are impacting the homeless in your community. So that's one problem. Now you could say, oh, well, they do track how many people got housed, and they do track kind of how long they've been homeless. Okay, that's great, but that's a process measure. It's not an outcome measure. The other way that I'm going to answer this with respect to some of the money being made out there is the way that the law and the regulation provides for what they call services. So the single most expensive commodity in California is real estate. Think about it. So if there's an opportunity for the local governments to acquire more real estate with the help of the state or with HUD, then that's a good deal. I'm going to gobble up that real estate. The problem is when you provide this housing and you don't include the kind of intensive services that are required to get people healthy and to get people into treatment and to get people stabilized. When you don't require that, then it just becomes a real estate speculation venture. And the amount of fees that these affordable housing developers gain from developer fees from the city or the county is obscene. Now, and this is just a problem because there is a financial incentive to create this housing, but to do it in such a way that you maximize your developer fees. And that's why the per unit cost of permanent supportive housing is anywhere between $350,000 to, in some instances in Los Angeles, over $700,000 a unit.
Right.
There is no incentive to deliver quality. There's no incentive for price consciousness. In fact, there's no incentive. So here's the thing. Yeah, it's expensive to afford an apartment here in Southern California. I think a lot of us at one point of our lives had to basically find a roommate so that you could cut the costs. But finding a roommate is prohibited for HUD permanent supportive housing. Every person is entitled to their own unit. And that just goes against kind of the natural inclinations of people to say, look, I want to do this, but I want to do it in the least cost way. The way that the government provides housing is in the most cost way. And to me, that causes a lot of concern in terms of who's really benefiting. We know that it's not the homeless that are benefiting because their numbers are going up. We know that the dollars are going up as the units are going up. So who's really benefiting?
Yeah, I did see those numbers. It's $750,000 per unit in Los Angeles. And I think that kind of leads to the kind of the crippling reality that we can never build our way out of this problem. It's just not feasible to do in these really high market communities, especially like Southern California in the Bay Area. It's not possible. And to put that burden on cities, like you said, the council, the city doesn't have that kind of money. The council doesn't have that power. To build each unit that we would need to get every person off the street, the city absolutely doesn't have that money. We just tried to build an aquatic center and we had to bond it out for $43 million. So, obviously we don't have the money for these services for taxpayers, much less for people living on the street. I'm sure everybody's probably seen this by now, but in San Francisco, they just released the numbers that they're spending $6,000 per tent for this program they got going on there. $6,000 per tent per month. It's unbelievable how the money that's getting spent here. And like you said, the homeless aren't seeing any benefit from it. They're not getting off the street. One of the just kind of going back to what you said earlier, we're putting these numbers out from homeless like service providers saying, well, we fed this many people today. I remember at the beginning of COVID, the city of Oceanside partnered with the Oceanside Kitchen Collective, and a number came out, said, I think after a year, they said we fed 35,000 meals. We provided 35,000 meals to people living on the street. Spent hundreds of thousands of dollars for it, and that was the directive. I think in that same time, our numbers dropped off about 30 people living on the street while we provided 35,000 meals. So it's the metrics are all against us. It's not working in our favor, and we're really not seeing anything work from it. And I've talked to a few people here in Oceanside, and they would like to propose kind of what we've seen throughout some of these other cities in California, is the small housing community where we're building these small sheds or these small kind of living enclosures that get people out of tents and kind of into these communities with some sort of structured housing element. And I have some concerns that, on the face of it, it looks like it's going to help get people off the street, but then we're spending a lot of money, and then these people just end up staying in these units, and there's no requirements for them to rehabilitate. There's no requirements for them to get jobs. There's no wraparound portions of this, and we're not really seeing their lives improve here.
Yeah. So if you looked at the San Francisco Chronicle with the article about $6,000 per site, per tent site, you probably also saw the article that said that 70% of the folks who were offered services refused. 70%. The challenge with the tiny house concept are two. First challenge is that the people who are going to accept those services are the people who are going to be able to rationally say, it's better for me to go in this tiny house because it meets my needs than for me to live on the streets. What that does is that you just skipped over all the people who need treatment and who need assistance, who aren't going to be able to make that rational decision. So you're essentially providing a low-cost tiny house to the same population that would be eligible for permanent supportive housing. The only person that is serving is the continuum of care, because now they can deliver more units at less cost because they're small, and HUD doesn't have a position. HUD doesn't fund those things, and the reason they don't fund those things is they're not safe to live in. A lot of them don't have sanitation. A lot of them don't have proper insulation. So there's some real challenges with them. But the other issue is, and this is just me personally, I don't have a problem with tiny houses necessarily, as long as you provide the kind of services that are going to be intensive and move people into recovery. If you want to have, and Oliver just mentioned something about pallet homes. I'm very familiar with pallet homes. Pallet homes actually, are fine. Pallet shelters, they're fine. The problem is this: are you going to provide the kind of services that are really going to help people, so they just are not going to be spending, their lives in these pallet shelters? Is there ways that you can actually get them out? So the issue to me isn't really the housing. The issue to me is the supportive community. It's the supportive therapeutic community that you're going to be helping people in. So, and my experience is that when you have a program that micromanages the providers and the communities from the state and from the federal government, the first thing that goes is the intensive services, because they're the most expensive things, but those are the most critical things. And that's why I'm a big fan of Solutions for Change. Solutions for Change creates a supportive therapeutic community so that people can move beyond the issues that first caused them to be homeless in the first place. So you might not like some of the rules, some of the things like that, but what they do really well is create a strong, supportive community so that people are helping one another overcome the challenges that led to their homelessness in the first place.
So when I first got involved in this issue, I went and met with everybody. I met with Tim, my Bread of Life. I met with Alex from Interfaith. I met with Chris over at Solutions. And, everybody kind of has their different approach. And I know people have a lot of issue with Solutions and Chris Megason, but I really like the approach there. I talked to some of the people. I know some of them are, some of these people who rehabilitated their lives are in our group, and they've messaged me with these stories saying, I was addicted to meth, and I was lost in my substance abuse, and I lost my kids, and I got involved in this program, and I started learning how to understand my anger and my issues and get away from the drugs. And I got these skills to learn how to work. And now I went through, I don't remember how long Chris's program is, it was 300 days or something like that. But it was this really extensive program where people went through the steps and figured it out and then started going through the different, what do you call it, campuses that he has to kind of transition people from different areas and get them working and get them back eventually into their own apartment with them paying for the rent. So I know there's a lot of issues there that people don't like him for various reasons. I love the program. I know it works for a lot of people, and I think there's a kind of a place for everybody as long as we're seeing results. And Chris is doing that with all private money. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. Here's the challenge. Why does the federal government, why does the state of California mandate one approach and mandate what works on the programmatic level or not? If a program works, if you can actually show that people are moving from homelessness into self-sufficiency or into treatment or into whatever it should be done, they should benefit from that. But what the federal government does and what the state of California does is it picks winners and losers. And my belief is that they pick winners and losers because they have an interest in who the winners are and they want to punish the losers. And I think that's wrong. If a community says, look, we want to support the programs, for example, I hope that people's heads don't explode. But if the community wants to support places that have sobriety requirements, the community should be allowed to make that decision. HUD shouldn't, and the state of California shouldn't. We should have programs tailored to the community. If you did that, you would have less NIMBYism. So I wanted to respond to Oliver. He asked a question a couple of times. He said, who should we lobby? We should lobby our state assembly person, which is Tasha Borner-Horvath, and we should lobby Mike Levin, our congressperson, and I can tell you exactly who to lobby on what issue. But I saw you ask that question a couple of times, so I wanted to make sure that you got it. You're welcome.
Paul, I'd love for you to put together some information and maybe post it to the group so that we can actually, and again with contact, so that we can have our people start reaching out and hopefully start pushing that issue to really get the conversation moving ahead, because it's something that nobody really wants to tackle because it's a really hard, volatile issue to kind of bring up. It almost seems like no matter what position you take, you're going to have people upset with you. But what we've been doing almost seems like nothing, and it's not working. So I think you have a great point that if we can really start even removing this cap on beds for psychiatric use, I think that would make a really, really big impact. And I can't see anybody who would be willing to kind of go against that. It seems like a very reasonable option here.
I agree. And yeah, so I'm happy. I've got some resources on, for example, the IMD exclusion, and I have another resource on the Landerman-Petra Short Act. They're on my website. These are things that are complicated, but I write everything so that the person who has no idea what to do with mental illness or what to do with homelessness, they can just read and it's clear language. I think one of the challenges on this issue is we made things too complicated. And in my world, if I'm driving and I see an encampment and I see people who are suffering because they're in psychosis, we need to help that person. The details are how we help that person, and my goal is to make the details as accessible as possible. So if you go to hopestreetcoalition.org, that's my website. I'm building it out. I'm adding resources. I'm putting new blog posts on there. I'd love it if you signed up and get to my newsletter. We are creating a yeah, I know the Twitter link isn't working. I'm getting that fixed. Sorry, Oliver. And also the Instagram, but I don't even understand Instagram. I don't take pictures with my phone of my food and think that it's important for other people to see it. So anyway, but I'm just an old guy and I don't understand Instagram at all. But my point is that we are putting together a little advocacy campaign on ending the cap to states for psychiatric capacity. So, sign up. And when we get those resources together and put those lists together of the people to contact for that, I can let you know. And I'll put some resources on Take Back Oceanside. I've been putting some articles on there, and I think I've gotten some pretty good responses. And you know what? I love the fact that you've got a diverse audience and people don't agree. And my thinking is, you know what? If you don't agree, that's okay. Start your own organization and raise money and make it happen. If you can't raise money, then that tells you there's not much of a demand for what it is you're selling. But if you can raise money and people really want to support what you do, well, maybe there's something there. So my hope is, if you like what you hear, go to my website, sign up. When I get around to putting a donate button on there, tell me how much you like it by sending me a little donation. So that's the way I'll gauge whether or not I'm successful or not.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Paul. And Oliver makes a great point, saying that this, it's such a complicated and complex issue, and I think there's a lot of benefit to trying to simplify that, to give a real easy call to action for some people who agree with what you're saying and want to try to make their voice heard. Because again, all of us, we have jobs, we have families, we have obligations. Not everybody has the time to get into this, have these conversations, and kind of educate themselves on this. So I think having just real easy calls to action here is going to really hopefully create some change here for us.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think also I want to follow up on this resolution. I've talked to some council members in Vista about this resolution about pushing the state or pushing the federal government on these various issues. And I think there's opportunity in Oceanside as well. I know that one thing that elected officials like, and they like to do things that make the public happy. So if it's a no-cost solution to pass a resolution to basically encouraging the state or encouraging the federal government to do the right thing, I think that's a lot easier than asking for X millions of dollars to do something that can be a little controversial.
Well, the price is right.
The price is right. Yeah, and here's the thing, there's benefit in raising awareness just through the resolution process. So I talk to city council people all the time, and I tell them, I say, did you know that there's a federal policy that limits the capacity of the number of psychiatric beds, so that when your sheriff picks somebody up for a 5150, they can't find him a bed and they kick him and they go back to the street? And people are like, no, I had no idea. So it's all about raising awareness and get people to understand what's going on.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure. I always enjoy our conversations, and I hope we can do this again. I really appreciate everybody joining tonight. I think we discussed a lot of topics, and I think we'll get some of this information up on the group, and we'll try to make some progress on this.
Great. Thank you very much, Drew. Thanks to everybody. I appreciate everybody's attention. That's it's been really great. Thanks, Teddy.
All right, everybody. Well, you have a great night, and we'll do this again here shortly.
All right.